The man behind the door. I was 22 years old, flat broke, and absolutely convinced that New York City was going to be my fresh start. I'd landed a job at a mid-sized marketing firm in Midtown. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills and it felt like the first real step toward the life I'd been chasing since graduation. The problem was, I was living with my parents in Connecticut, and that commute was a nightmare. I simply couldn't sustain. 3 hours round trip on a good day. 2 train transfers. Standing room only. I did it for 2 weeks and nearly lost my mind. So I did what every broke 22-year-old does when they're desperate for housing in New York City. I went online and started scrolling through listings. I checked every platform I could find. Most of what I found was either way out of my budget or genuinely terrifying in a different kind of way. Tiny closets being rented for $1,200 a month, listings with no pictures, descriptions with typos so bad they were practically unreadable. I was starting to feel like this was hopeless when I spotted it. A listing for a private bedroom in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood on the west side of Manhattan. The price was listed at $550 a month. For New York City. In Hell's Kitchen. My first reaction was that it had to be a scam, but I clicked anyway because that's what desperation does to you. The listing was sparse. A few blurry photos of a small but livable bedroom, a kitchen that looked functional, and a living room with a couch and a television. There was a contact number at the bottom. I called it within 30 seconds. The man who answered introduced himself as the landlord and told me the place was still available. His voice had an odd, clipped quality to it. Not unfriendly exactly, but stilted somehow, like he was reading from a script. He told me to come by the next afternoon to take a look. I said yes before he even finished his sentence. The following day, I took the subway into the city and found the building, a narrow pre-war walk-up on a street that smelled like a combination of food carts and old rain. The landlord met me in the lobby. He was a heavy-set man in his late 40s or early 50s, with small eyes that didn't quite hold your gaze, and a way of standing slightly too close when he spoke. I told myself he was just socially awkward. Plenty of people are socially awkward. It doesn't mean anything. He showed me the apartment. It was on the 4th floor, and the place was small but workable. The bedroom I'd be renting faced a brick wall, but it got some light and it had a closet. The bathroom was shared. The kitchen was narrow. The living room had a window that actually faced the street, which felt like a small luxury. "There is one thing," the landlord said, pausing in the hallway outside the second bedroom. "You'll have a roommate. His name is Bren. He keeps to himself mostly, very quiet. You won't even know he's there." I told him that was fine by me. I wasn't looking for a social partner. I just needed a place to sleep. The landlord knocked on Bren's door. 3 short raps followed by a longer one. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. "He might be resting," the landlord said, smiling faintly. "You'll meet him when you move in." I signed the application that evening, and the next day the landlord called to tell me the room was mine. I was so relieved I practically shouted. I spent the rest of the week packing, and the following Saturday my father drove down from Connecticut to help me move in. We made 4 trips up and down those 4 flights of stairs with boxes and furniture. My dad was 61 years old and never once complained, even though I could tell his knees were killing him by the 3rd trip. The whole time we were moving things in, all those hours of noise and commotion and the front door propped open, Bren never appeared. Not once. My dad and I both noticed. I could hear something in the room, though. Quiet sounds, a shift of weight, a creak of floorboards. Someone was definitely in there. Shy guy, my dad said, and left it at that. When my dad finally drove back to Connecticut and I was alone in my new apartment for the first time, I sat on the edge of my bed and felt the particular mix of pride and terror that comes with actually doing something you've been afraid to do. I opened my laptop and started watching a show to calm my nerves. About an hour into the episode, I heard it, the sound of Bren's door opening. I paused the show, set the laptop aside, figured this was my shot to introduce myself. I got up, moved toward my bedroom door, reached for the handle, and then the front door to the apartment slammed shut. I opened my bedroom door and stepped into the living room. Empty. Just the hum of the city outside and the tick of the radiator. Bren had somehow moved from his room to the front door without me catching even a glimpse of him. That struck me as strange, but I told myself I was being paranoid. The guy just wanted space. Fine. I went back to my room, ate a bowl of ramen over the sink, and eventually fell asleep. I woke up sometime past midnight. The front door clicked shut in the distance. Then footsteps. The wood floors in that apartment were old, and they announced every movement. Slow, deliberate steps that crossed the living room and made their way down the short hallway toward the bedrooms. They stopped directly outside my door. I sat up slowly, holding my breath. I watched the thin strip of light along the bottom of my door, and there they were, the unmistakable outlines of 2 feet, standing still just on the other side of the wood. He wasn't moving. He wasn't knocking. He was just standing there, the seconds stretched out like taffy. I didn't speak. I didn't move. My hand was on my phone, but I didn't pick it up. My bedroom door had no lock. That fact had seemed irrelevant before. It didn't anymore. Eventually, the feet turned. The footsteps retreated. I heard Bren's door click shut. I lay back down and stared at the ceiling. After a while, I heard sounds from the other room, rhythmic, muffled thumps like something being dragged or rearranged. It went on for a long time. I don't know what hour it was when I finally fell back asleep. The next morning, Bren seemed to be out. I used the silence to explore the apartment properly, checked the kitchen cabinets, figured out the water pressure in the shower, made coffee. It was almost normal. I spent most of the day out, walked to the nearby grocery store, found a pharmacy, grabbed lunch at a diner on 9th Avenue. By the time I got back to the apartment in the evening, arms full of groceries, I was starting to feel like maybe I could make this work. I dropped the bags on the couch, made myself dinner, watched something on the television. Bren never came home. Around 9 o'clock, I realized I'd forgotten to grab toothpaste at the pharmacy, so I made a quick run to a convenience store 2 blocks up. I was gone maybe 15 minutes. When I came back and pushed open the apartment door, I noticed immediately that Bren's door was cracked open, just a few inches, with the light on inside. I stood in the hallway for a moment, grocery bag in hand. This was my chance. Better to get this first introduction over with, I figured. I walked over to his door and knocked twice, gently, then pushed it open and looked inside. The room was empty. Not just empty of people, empty of everything. No bed, no dresser, no boxes, no books, no clothes. Nothing on the walls, nothing on the floor except a single chair, a plain wooden chair, the kind you'd find in an old schoolroom, sitting alone in the corner of the room like something placed there deliberately, waiting for something. My heart started hammering so hard, I could feel it in my throat. I reached in and flipped off the light, pulled the door shut, walked very quickly to my own room, shut the door, and sat on the edge of my bed, pressing my palms flat against my thighs to stop my hands from shaking. There was no Bren. There had never been a Bren. So, who had been walking around this apartment at midnight? whose feet had stood outside my door in the dark. I picked up my phone and called the landlord. It rang once, and from somewhere inside my closet, clear, close, unmistakable, I heard a phone ringing. The world seemed to tilt. My mouth went dry. The phone rang a second time, then a click and voicemail. I stared at the closet door. The ringing had stopped after exactly 2 rings, meaning whoever was on the other end had seen the call and declined it. Deliberately, the landlord had his phone in his hand, and his phone was in my closet. I moved faster than I've ever moved in my life. I was out of my bedroom into the bathroom, door locked, sitting on the tile floor with my back against the tub before I even fully processed what I was doing. I dialed 911, told them everything, gave them the address. The police arrived within 6 minutes. I heard them knock, heard the apartment door open, heard voices and heavy footsteps moving through the rooms, then a pause, then more movement. They found him under my bed, not in the closet where I'd heard the phone, under my bed. He'd moved while I was in the bathroom. The officer who came to get me was careful with his words, but I could tell by his expression that even he found it disturbing. It turned out there was no lease. The landlord wasn't a landlord at all. He didn't own the apartment and had no legal authority to rent it. The police couldn't tell me the full story of how he'd gotten the keys, or how long he'd had them. There were elements of the investigation they weren't disclosing. My father came back the next morning. We moved everything out. I didn't look at the room where that chair had been sitting. I didn't look at the space under my bed. I found a new apartment the following week. It was more expensive and farther from the office, but the locks were solid, and the bedroom door latched properly, and I slept with every light on for about a month. I knew from the moment I first met that man in the lobby that something was off about him. I rationalized it the way people do. I needed the apartment. I needed the price. I needed to believe it was going to be okay. I think about that chair sometimes. One chair in an empty room aimed at the door. I still don't know what it was for. What was in the basement? I've worked manual jobs my whole life. It's just who I am. After spending 2 years on a cattle ranch in Texas, I took a position at a poultry processing facility in rural Georgia. The work was physical, the hours were early, and it paid reasonably well for the area. What it didn't come with was housing, and the nearest town was a good 45-minute drive down a 2-lane highway that turned into a skating rink any time it rained. So when I spotted a handwritten index card on the break room bulletin board, room for rent, 5 minutes from facility, weekly rate, see Roy. I called the number that same afternoon. Roy answered on the second ring. His voice was deep and unhurried, the kind of voice that sounds like it hasn't been surprised by anything in decades. He told me the room was furnished, the house was on a few acres, and he expected his tenants to respect the property and stay out of his way. No lease. Cash by the week. I told him that suited me just fine. The house was a wide, single-story structure set back from the road behind a row of pine trees. Roy met me on the porch. He was somewhere in his 70s, lean with a white beard that he kept neatly trimmed and eyes that were pale blue and extremely alert. He shook my hand once, firmly, and showed me to the spare room off the back hallway. The room had a bed, a dresser, a window that looked out over a field. It was clean and quiet and smelled faintly of cedar. I had my work clothes in a duffel bag in my truck. I moved in that evening. Roy and I didn't interact much. He cooked his own meals at times that didn't overlap with mine, watched the news in the living room after dinner, and went to bed at 8 o'clock without variation. I respected his routines. He was quiet. I was quiet. It worked. The first 3 weeks passed without incident. Then came the night I woke up to the bedroom door opening. It was past 11. I'd been asleep for a couple of hours after a long shift. The door swung inward slowly and the light from the hallway fell across the floor in a long rectangle. Roy was standing in the doorway. He was wearing a flannel robe and his hands were at his sides, and he was looking at me with those pale blue eyes. "Stay out of the basement," he said. His voice was the same as always, deep, unhurried, completely calm, like he was commenting on the weather. Then he shut the door and I heard his footsteps retreating down the hallway. I sat up in the dark and worked through the logical possibilities. I hadn't been in the basement. I hadn't even thought about the basement. There was a door off the kitchen that I'd assumed led downstairs, but I'd never touched it. So either Roy was confused or he was warning me because he thought I might go down there. Or, and this was the thought I kept circling back to, he was warning me because he knew I'd eventually be curious enough to look. The next morning, Roy took his truck somewhere around 10 o'clock. I watched from the kitchen window until the dust cloud from his driveway had settled. Then I stood in front of the basement door for a solid 2 minutes. I told myself I was just going to open it. Just crack it and look down. Just see what was down there that was so important to keep me away from. The door opened onto a narrow staircase. The smell hit me first, something damp and slightly rotten, but faint enough that I convinced myself it was just old wood and Georgia humidity. I found the light switch at the bottom of the stairs and clicked it on. The main basement was mostly unremarkable. A water heater in one corner, some shelving with old tools and paint cans, a workbench along one wall. Normal basement stuff. I was almost relieved, almost ready to go back upstairs and forget the whole thing. Then I noticed the door in the back corner. It was a plain wooden door, but something about it was wrong. There was a thick rubber gasket running along the bottom edge, the kind used to seal out drafts, or, I realized with a slow, sick feeling, seal out smell. The smell I'd caught at the top of the stairs was noticeably stronger near this door. I stood in front of it for a moment. My hands were steady, but my pulse was not. I opened it. The smell was immediate and overwhelming, a heavy biological rot that made my eyes water before I could stop myself from flinching. The room inside was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet. The walls were bare concrete. The floor was concrete too, and it was dark in patches, dark in ways that I slowly understood were not dirt. In the far corner, a row of heavy black plastic bags were stacked against the wall. Each one was large. Each one had a shape to it, the kind of irregular, compacted weight that you don't want to think too hard about. In the upper corner of the room, mounted at an angle, was a camera, pointing at a workbench in the center of the floor. I took out my phone. My hands were shaking badly enough that the first photo came out blurry. The second one was clearer. I took 3 more for good measure, then walked backward out of that room, pulled the door shut, and went back up the stairs as quickly and quietly as I could. I was upstairs, in the spare room, stuffing my clothes into my duffel bag when I heard the front door open downstairs. Roy was home. I heard him in the kitchen. Then I heard the particular creak of the basement door opening. Then footsteps on the stairs, heavy, deliberate, going down. I picked up my duffel bag and walked out of the bedroom, through the hallway, past the kitchen entrance, and straight out the front door. I didn't look back. I crossed the porch, stepped off into the dirt drive, reached my truck, got in, and was driving before the door had swung fully shut behind me. I drove 40 miles before I stopped, well past the facility, past the town, all the way to my brother's property outside of Macon. My brother met me on his porch with a look that said he already knew something was wrong. I showed him the photographs. He called 911 while I was still scrolling through them. The dispatcher sent a deputy to the house with instructions to bring a warrant. I gave the dispatcher Roy's address and made it clear I was a paying tenant, not an intruder, and that I had visual evidence requiring immediate investigation. My brother sat with me while I waited. 3 hours later, a deputy arrived at my brother's property and asked for my identification and a formal statement. I gave both without hesitation. The deputy told me Roy had been taken into custody. He said Roy had been in the process of removing materials from the basement when law enforcement arrived. He said they found enough to make the arrest immediately. He said he couldn't tell me more than that. I stayed with my brother for 3 weeks. I didn't go back to the house. I didn't contact Roy. I found a room in town eventually. A proper apartment with proper locks, rented from a property management company, with a website and a physical office. I still think about those bags sometimes, the shape of them, the weight they implied. I try not to finish the thought. Some knowledge, I've decided, is worse to have than not to have. The photograph was enough. The photograph was more than enough. The guy with the flash. If you went to college, you know the particular anxiety of walking into your dorm room for the very first time. Your roommate is already assigned, a stranger selected by an algorithm or a housing lottery, someone you've never met and may have nothing in common with, someone you will now share approximately 200 square feet with for the next academic year. You go in hoping for a friend. You settle for civil. Sometimes you get something that's neither. I moved into my freshman dorm at a state university in the Pacific Northwest in late August. The building was a long brick structure from the 1960s, the kind with communal bathrooms and thin walls and floors that announced every footstep. My room was on the second floor, middle of the hallway. When I pushed open the door, my roommate was already there. He was sitting at his desk with his back to the door, headphones on, the glow of a computer monitor lighting up the side of his face. He turned around when he heard me come in. He was pale, with dark hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a quality to him that I immediately, and perhaps unfairly, clocked as deeply interior. He was the kind of person who seemed to exist slightly behind himself, like the visible version of him was a few seconds behind whatever was actually happening inside. His name was Marcus. He shook my hand with the particular handshake that communicates volumes. Limp, quick, no grip, release before you're ready. I made my bed, unpacked my clothes, went and knocked on doors up and down the hall to introduce myself. I clicked with a few of the other guys immediately. A kid from Sacramento who played guitar, a guy from Portland who was outrageously funny, a girl from Spokane who'd read every book I'd ever mentioned loving. I came back to the room feeling good, ready to give Marcus a real shot. That first night I tried. I asked him where he was from, a suburb of Seattle, what he was planning to study, computer science, whether he knew anyone else at the school. No. He answered each question in the abbreviated, technically sufficient way of someone who finds conversation expensive. Not rude, just sealed. He went to bed at 10 o'clock, lights off, no discussion. I put in earbuds and watched videos on my phone until midnight, then went to sleep. The next morning I went to the dining hall with some of the guys from the hall. Good morning, big breakfast, easy conversation. When I came back to the room, I reached for my duffel bag, the big canvas one I'd packed with valuables and documents. And something was immediately wrong. It was in a different position. Not dramatically different, but different enough that I felt it in my body before I consciously registered what I was seeing. I looked at Marcus. He was sitting on his bed, reading. I went through the bag. I couldn't identify anything obviously missing, but the contents felt shifted, disturbed. The way a bag feels when someone has moved things around and then tried to put them back. "Did you go through my bag?" I asked. He looked up. And here's the thing. His denial was not the denial of someone who's embarrassed or caught off guard. It was hard, flat, almost offended. He said he didn't know what I was talking about with a firmness that, paradoxically, made me more suspicious rather than less. I had no proof. I let it go. 2 nights later, I tried to include him again. A few of us were walking to a late-night pizza spot, and I knocked on his side of the room to ask if he wanted to come. He declined, citing homework. Fair enough. When I came back, the room was dark and Marcus was asleep, or appeared to be. I fell asleep to the sound of rain hitting the window. I woke up in the early hours. The room was dark. I wasn't sure what had woken me. I lay still for a moment, eyes adjusting, and then I noticed it. Flashes. Brief, white, strobe-quick flashes coming from somewhere in the room. One. A gap. Another. A gap. I thought lightning. It had been raining. Storms roll in fast in the Pacific Northwest. I pulled the blanket up and let my eyes close again. The next morning, my backpack, which I'd left by my desk, zipper fully closed, was not where I'd left it. The zipper was open slightly. I checked it methodically. My laptop was there. My wallet was there. But things had been moved. I was certain of it. I didn't say anything to Marcus this time. Instead, I made a decision. That night, I got into bed at midnight, turned off my lamp, pulled the blanket up, and stayed completely awake, staring at the ceiling, listening. Marcus's bed was against the opposite wall, maybe 8 feet away. I listened to the quiet shuffle of him settling in. I listened to rain against the window. I watched the ceiling. Around 2 in the morning, I saw it again, a flash, then another, coming from Marcus's side of the room. I flipped over to face his direction. He was sitting upright in his bed. I could see the outline of him in the darkness, and I caught the image clearly for just a fraction of a second before he registered that I'd turned. His arms coming down, something held in his hands being lowered quickly toward the mattress. Flashes. He had been taking photographs of me, in my bed, in the dark, with his phone's flash enabled. "What are you doing?" I asked. He said he couldn't sleep. That was all. I couldn't sleep. As if that explained anything. The next day, I told the guys on the floor what had happened. They were collectively horrified in the way you are when something falls into the category of wrong that you don't quite have words for. They said I should report it. Get a room transfer. Get out. I went back to the room to get my things, planning to go straight to the housing office. Marcus was gone, unusual since he rarely left. His laptop was on his bed, lid slightly open. I opened it. I'm not going to pretend I didn't know I was snooping. I knew. I also knew I needed to know what was on that computer. The desktop was a disaster. Icons and folders stacked everywhere. Images thumbnailed in rows. I started clicking through. Most of it was school-related. Some of it was strange in minor ways. Obsessive organizational systems, lists of things I didn't recognize. And then I found the folder. It was labeled with a string of numbers, the kind of label that suggests someone who is accustomed to being systematic about things they know they shouldn't have. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, pictures of me sleeping, taken from across the room, iPhone flash bouncing off the dark in those brief white bursts that I'd felt more than seen. Pictures of the inside of my duffel bag, pictures of the contents of my backpack laid out on what appeared to be the desk, taken while I was in class or in the dining hall. I opened the video recording app on my phone and pointed it at the laptop screen. Recorded for 90 seconds. Then I methodically deleted every photograph I could find, closed the laptop, walked out of the room, and went straight to the housing office. I showed them the video. I explained everything. The flashes, the bags, the denial. I requested an immediate room change, citing violations of personal privacy. The housing coordinator watched the video twice with an expression that shifted from skeptical to quiet and serious. She told me a new room would be arranged for the following morning and that the situation would be handled through the appropriate university channels. I don't know what discipline Marcus faced. The housing office wasn't required to tell me, and I didn't push. What I do know is that my last night in that room was one of the longest of my life. I lay in my bed with my eyes open, listening to every shift and creak from his side of the room. At some point past 3 in the morning, I heard his mattress move, then silence. Then, and I could not be certain of this, but I was as certain of it as I've ever been of anything, I heard him exhale softly. Close, from somewhere directly above me. He was standing over my bed. I didn't move. I couldn't make myself move. I stared at the ceiling and counted seconds, and eventually, I heard the mattress springs accept his weight again. And then, nothing until morning. I was packed and out before 7 a.m. My new room was on the other side of campus. Different building, different floor, different roommate, a guy from Tacoma named Darius who played basketball and kept the room immaculately clean and talked loudly on the phone to his mom every Sunday evening. It was the most normal thing in the world, and it felt like someone had opened a window after months in a sealed room. I transferred campuses the following year. I still don't know what Marcus wanted with those photographs. I've thought about it more times than I'd like to admit, and I've never arrived at a satisfying answer. Some people carry a darkness that they've learned to make invisible, until you happen to catch the light at the wrong angle. I caught it at the right angle, and I got out. Sundowning. Moving out of your parents' house is supposed to feel like freedom, like stepping through a door into the life you've been building in your head for years. For me, it felt less like stepping through a door and more like falling through one. Unplanned, slightly uncontrolled, and with a lot of uncertainty about what was waiting at the bottom. I was 25 when I finally did it. No dramatic reason. I'd been saving. I had a stable job in medical billing that I did mostly remotely, and I'd simply reached the point where living at home felt like wearing clothes that were 2 sizes too small. My dad's college friend, a woman named Patricia, had been subletting a 2-bedroom apartment in Charlotte, North Carolina for a few years. When she heard I was looking, she reached out and offered me the second room at a rate I couldn't argue with. There was, however, a condition. I'm already splitting it with someone else, Patricia told me over the phone. A woman named Elaine. She's in her early 60s, retired school teacher. Perfectly lovely. I just need you to know going in that it's a 3-person situation. I said that was fine. I was 25. What did I know? The apartment was already furnished. Patricia had been there long enough to accumulate furniture, so all I brought was my bed, a nightstand, and 2 boxes of personal items. Patricia introduced me to Elaine the afternoon I moved in. Elaine was a small woman with silver hair, worn short, very neat in her appearance, and an initial warmth that felt genuine. She shook my hand with both of hers and told me she was delighted to have a young person in the apartment. I thought, this is going to be fine. The first night, I sat in the living room watching television after dinner. Patricia had gone to bed early. She had an early work call. It was just me and the TV, and the comfortable sounds of an apartment settling into night. The show I was watching had just hit an interesting moment when I felt, rather than saw, something in my peripheral vision. I turned. Elaine's head was visible just around the edge of the hallway wall. Just her face, the rest of her body hidden behind the corner. Her eyes fixed on me with an expression I couldn't immediately classify. It wasn't anger. It wasn't confusion. It was something more hollow than either of those. As I watched, her lips began to move, but the sounds that came out were not words. They were low, rhythmic moaning sounds, almost tuneless, like someone humming a song they've forgotten the melody of. "Elaine," I said, "you okay?" The humming stopped. She looked at me for another second. Then her head disappeared back around the corner. I sat there for a moment, processing. Then I called Patricia. "She does have a health history," Patricia said carefully. "But when I met her, she seemed completely fine. I'm sorry. I should have mentioned this. I'll talk to her tomorrow." The next morning, Elaine was in the kitchen making herself tea when I came out for coffee. She said good morning to me cheerfully. She asked how I'd slept. She mentioned she'd seen a rabbit in the building's courtyard the previous afternoon. She was entirely seamlessly normal. I mentioned carefully the previous night, the hallway, the sounds. She looked at me with genuine confusion. She had no memory of it. None. She seemed mildly distressed that I was describing something she couldn't place in her own timeline. I let it drop. 3 nights later, I was in bed, laptop open, movie playing. The rest of the apartment was quiet. I'd gotten into the habit of leaving my bedroom door slightly ajar. The room ran warm, and the hallway carried a cross breeze from the building's ventilation. A knock at the door. I paused the movie. Waited. The knock came again, and behind it, underneath it, those same low moaning sounds from the hallway 3 nights ago. Rhythmic, tuneless, coming from right outside my door. The knock continued. Not aggressive, almost methodical, as if she was waiting for something specific, some response that only she knew the parameters of. The moaning wove through the knocking in a way that made the hair on my arm stand up in a slow, certain wave. My door had no lock. I sat absolutely still in my bed and waited. The knocking went on for what I estimated was about 60 to 90 seconds. Though time does strange things when you're sitting in the dark, listening to sounds you can't explain. Then it stopped. The sounds faded. I heard footsteps, moving away down the hallway. I lay down but didn't sleep for a long time. I told myself it was a medical condition. I told myself she wasn't aware. I told myself the right thing to do was be patient and compassionate and speak to Patricia again in the morning. I fell asleep eventually and woke up to darkness. The clock on my nightstand said 1:47 a.m. The room was dark. The movie had long since ended. I lay still trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it, a soft creak in the floor. Inside my room. I turned my head slowly toward the foot of my bed. She was there, standing at the foot of my bed, in the dark, wearing a white nightgown, her silver hair loose and tangled, her eyes half open and staring in my direction with the unfocused gaze of someone existing in a place I couldn't see. She was making the sounds again, low, moaning, like something in her was trying to surface and couldn't quite break through. The first thing I noticed, before I fully processed any of the rest of it, was what she was holding. A kitchen knife, held loosely in her right hand, at her side, the blade catching the faint light from the window. I screamed. I don't remember making the decision to scream. It just happened, the sound tearing out of me before I knew it was there. I pressed myself into the corner of the bed, back against the headboard, arms up. She didn't react. She didn't lunge. She didn't raise the knife. She just stood there making her sounds, and then, slowly, without acknowledgement of anything that had just happened, she turned and walked out of the room. I was across the floor before she'd reached the hallway. I pushed my nightstand in front of the door. Then I sat on my bed with my phone in my hands, trying to call Patricia, who didn't answer because it was nearly 2 a.m. I didn't sleep again. I sat in that room with the nightstand against the door and listened to the apartment until pale gray light started showing around the edges of the curtains. At 8 o'clock, I called Patricia. I told her everything. My voice was steadier than I expected. Patricia arrived within an hour. She sat with Elaine in the living room for a long time. She came to my room afterward and closed the door. She doesn't remember any of it, Patricia said. Not last night, not the other nights, nothing. Patricia reached out to Elaine's daughter that same day. Between the three of us, we researched what we were seeing and arrived at the same conclusion. Sundowning syndrome, a neurological symptom associated with dementia and Alzheimer's disease, characterized by increasing confusion, agitation, and behavioral changes that emerge or worsen in the late afternoon and evening hours as daylight fades. People experiencing severe episodes can act out in ways that bear no resemblance to their baseline personality. They often have no memory of it afterward. Elaine, during the day, was warm and thoughtful and organized. Elaine after dark was something else entirely, something that was not her fault, and was not chosen, and was not something she could control or even see happening. That doesn't make what happened any less terrifying in the moment. Terror doesn't require malice. It only requires not knowing what's coming next. Patricia couldn't evict Elaine without following the proper legal process, which in North Carolina takes considerably longer than a single phone call. She told me honestly that the fastest resolution for me was to find somewhere else to live while she managed the situation. She was sorry. She meant it. I moved out within the week. Elaine's daughter eventually arranged for her to move closer to family and receive proper supervised care. Patricia told me months later that Elaine's condition had progressed significantly over the following year, which made it clearer in retrospect how advanced things had already been when I was living there, and how urgent the intervention had been. I think about Elaine sometimes. I think about the person she was in the daylight. Bright, gracious, someone who noticed rabbits in courtyards and remembered to ask how you'd slept. I think about the distance between that person and the figure standing at the foot of my bed at 2 a.m. with a kitchen knife. We carry such complicated things inside us. Some of us carry things we don't even know are there until the light goes out. The thread that connects them. 4 stories. 4 apartments. 4 strangers. The fake landlord hiding in an apartment he didn't own, manufacturing a fictional roommate to explain away the sounds coming from the other room. The old man with his locked basement and his rubber-sealed door and his black bags stacked against the wall. The college roommate who spent weeks photographing a sleeping stranger and standing over his bed in the dark. The elderly woman who moved through the nighttime hours in a fog of dementia, her daytime warmth replaced by something hollow and unreachable. What connects them, beyond the obvious geography of shared walls and borrowed keys, is the question of how well we actually know the spaces we choose to inhabit. We sign leases and exchange pleasantries and tell ourselves that proximity creates safety. that knowing someone's name means knowing them, that a landlord is a landlord, that a roommate is just a stranger becoming familiar, that the strange noise from the next room is explainable. Sometimes it is explainable. Sometimes it's a water pipe, or a heavy sleeper, or someone just going about the ordinary business of being human behind a closed door. And sometimes the explanation, when it finally comes, is worse than the uncertainty ever was. The thing all four of these situations had in common was a moment, early, easy to dismiss, easy to rationalize away, where something felt wrong. The landlord who stood too close and smiled a beat too late. The old man in the doorway at 11 o'clock with his simple warning. The roommate who gave you the dead fish handshake and went to bed at 10. The woman whose face appeared around the corner in the dark. Every instinct we have evolved over thousands of years to notice exactly these signals. The mismatch between what someone is saying and what their body is doing. The explanation that almost makes sense but doesn't quite. The chill that moves through you in a warm room. We override those signals constantly. We tell ourselves we're being paranoid. We tell ourselves we're being unfair. We tell ourselves the situation calls for patience, for benefit of the doubt, for rational thinking. Sometimes that's the right call. But when your gut is telling you that something is fundamentally, categorically wrong, not just uncomfortable or unfamiliar, but wrong, there is no social cost worth paying to stay in a place that your own nervous system is trying to help you leave. Trust the chill in the warm room. Trust the footsteps that stop outside your door. Trust the locked door in the basement. Trust the light that flickers in the middle of the night when there is no storm. Trust yourself to leave.